stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. So I'm so excited today to introduce my podcast guest, John Odom. I met him through my husband, who works for a company called Civic Actions. And John wrote a book called Distributed Teams that I've been reading. One of the big things that I do is No Longer Virtual, which is a conference, a once-a-year conference that brings people together that have only met online. And it brings us together face-to-face so we can learn together face-to-face. One of the things I love about Civic Actions that I've written about is the fact that even though they don't have a corporate office and every employee is considered a remote or distributed employee, they make this huge effort every year to get everybody together face-to-face at a retreat somewhere in the country. And when I met John, I knew I had to interview him because he's really found ways to help people connect even though they're working remotely, and wrote a whole book about how to uncomplicate the communication channels to make that work. So, John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, you are totally welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. I would love to ask you a question that I ask at the beginning of every podcast episode. I always ask my guests to share something about themselves that most people don't know. And the reason I ask that is that I love to give our podcast audience something that connects them to the guest before they start to get into a really deep discussion and share our stories. So, do you have something that you could share with us?
Sure. Well, one is a very small thing, which is around how I pronounce my name. I also turned into a weird little social experiment for myself. So the name is John Oh.Dinn, and I used to introduce myself like that when I'd meet people. I'd be like, "Hi, my name is John Oh.Dinn." And it took me the longest time to figure out why, for some reason, particularly in America, people were calling me Jonathan. And it turns out they were hearing all of that sequence, John Oh.Dinn, as one first name, Jonathan. And then later on would send me emails that were like addressed to "Hi John," Jon, because I kept calling myself John, so they thought it was the abbreviation for Jonathan. And it took me 6 months to figure that out. And then they're like, "Wait, that's your name is not Jonathan? Well, why did you introduce yourself as Jonathan?" I'm like, no, it's John, pause, Oh.Dinn. And then I started trying, it just seemed kind of silly at that point. So I just introduced, I didn't like correcting people because it sounded so, I don't know, odd.
Condescending or...
Yeah, condescending
picky,
or pretentious or something. So I just said, I just stopped pronouncing my surname at all. I would just say John. And I did that for a long time, like over a decade. And then at one point, I was in a company office at one point, and I heard someone who was pronouncing my surname correctly, be corrected by somebody else who was pronouncing my surname incorrectly. and I can tell if people come across my name in writing for the first time, that's when they start trying to do things where they look at all the letters and they try and pronounce a sound that includes all the letters, and some of the letters are actually silent. And so this turned in, I just like, I have to start telling people. I can't just avoid this conversation. So I start trying to find ways to do it. So there. So that's the thing I'm still struggling with. But the name is John, and if you want the
John.
full name, it's John Odin. There.
Well, I find this to be a really important aspect of connection and communication. If somebody doesn't feel like they can correct somebody on the pronunciation of their name, how are they going to correct them when something is even, something more important in terms of the success of a project?
That's a good one. Starting off easy. All right. Because actually, I'm fine. I've actually no problem if something's a problem with a project, like like, oh, we're going to do this thing, and I'm like, wait, that won't work because of X. I'll happily talk about it and be respectful about it. But I have this thing around my name is actually the only one who's inconvenienced by my name being said wrong is me, and I should be able to just deal with it. And so I just impose it on myself. Whereas if it's a project that we're all working on and I see something that's a problem, I should call it out because it's important for all of us. My name
Right,
is
a
something.
responsibility.
So it's a group thing versus, oh, it's just an inconvenience for me and I'll just deal with it. And my opinion doesn't matter so much. There's a kind of an internal John, keeping it low profile and staying out of the way kind of thing.
Well, I think names are really important. And I don't know why I didn't do this with you. I usually ask people to pronounce their name for me before we hit the record button for podcasts, because I want to be absolutely sure that I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah.
And that's partly because people love to hear the sound of their name. You have a boost of oxytocin in your brain when somebody says your name in a way that brings light to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I find that to be really important. And I have a friend named Kimberly, and people often, especially Americans, will shorten it to Kim.
Oh, yeah.
And that's not her name.
Yep.
And she started correcting people. And I think there's a way to do it without sounding pretentious. But it is, you're right, it's hard to do that without sounding pretentious.
Yeah. I have friends, just so you know, it's not about Kimberly only. I have friends who they object to being called Dave when they actually want to be called David, or Tom and Thomas. It's a common thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, my son's name is Jacob, not Jake.
Just to add on that, it's also, at least, in my work, and I'm sure in yours too, we're interacting with people from all sorts of different cultures and different languages, different first languages, different second languages sometimes, and third languages. And not all names are, ASCII compatible, Western European, North American English names. And taking the time to actually figure out how to say it's a respect thing.
Mm-hmm. And, I was just going to say that. I worked on a team with a woman that we had a contractor. The guy's name was Garnett, and he is from the South. His name is Garnett, and he introduced himself as Garnett. And this woman on my team consistently pronounced it Garnet, like the stone.
Oh.
And every time we would be on a conference call, I would specifically say, okay, Garnett, kind of trying to give her the hint. And she continued to pronounce it wrong. And it occurred to me that it was more of a power thing for her than it was, and I don't think it was conscious, but I think it's really important for us to be aware of that. Like, as I said, our names are important to us. So where did your name come from? I know that Oh.Dinn is not an American name.
Correct. It's Irish, Gaelic, and it's my family name. And there's an interesting, it actually means different things. So in Gaelic, so the O, what you would see in American English is O space, and then the surname Dinn. Actually, that O is a word, and there's Scottish Gaelic and there's Irish Gaelic, and there's a few other variations of Gaelic as well, and they all have slightly different grammar rules. So Oh.Dinn, or O'Connor, or O'Reilly, or any of these things all mean son of, and then Dinn, or son of Riley, or son of Connor, so it's actually a separate word. So if you look up, and when they still made large, thin, yellow-paged telephone directories, the section O in the phone book in Ireland was really large because you had all these O'Malley's, O'Dinns, O'Connors, O'Reillys. Like, so O went on for quite a while. And also M for Mac, because there was a lot of Scottish people or Scottish heritage people had moved into Ireland at different times. So you had a lot of Macs, which were either MAC or MC, all in the phone book as well. But it's a word. And so in the same way as in Icelandic, you'll have Igor daughter, and that means the daughter of Igor. That's the way the names are, that's the surname of the human. And it tells you who you are related to in a literal sense.
I think that that's not unusual in languages other than English. And I didn't realize that O was son of, but in Hebrew, bar is son of and bat is daughter of.
Oh,
So
yeah.
when you're called to the bima, or where, the stage of a synagogue or a temple to participate in a ceremony, you're introduced as bat and then Rivka, blah, blah, blah. And
right.
Daughter of these two people.
Right.
So I guess it's not as unusual as we might have thought.
Yeah. I mean, and so like in Gaelic, you'll find, so like my sister, her surname is actually N-I, accent, space, and then the surname.
Oh.
And my mother, it's a U-I, accent, space. And because of a whole bunch of grammar rules, it's actually the surname has an extra H in it as well. So.
Oh goodness, that's confusing.
So people will look at, like, my sister's surname and my surname and be like, do you know each other? Are you related? Like, because they can't actually really tell unless you know all the context and the grammar.
Wow. Well, we could talk all day just on names.
I so never wanted a job in the Irish telephone directory company. That just seems like, and I'm sure this is true for other countries too, but it just seems like a, fraught with peril type job.
Yes, because names are important to people. When you get something wrong, it can be very insulting.
It's very upsetting, yeah.
Well, and on that note, it's easy to get things wrong when you are not face to face, because you're missing certain context of the conversation. And I think about that a lot, because if I'm struggling with the pronunciation of a name, if I can see the person saying it and get all of the shapes of their mouth and how they're saying it, I can watch their mouth, and I'm a lot more likely to catch on to how that should be pronounced. And as you said, most people that meet you might meet you after they've read your name written out, like I did, and just assumed it was Oh.Dinn or something like that. Right.
I was going to say, it's easy to, one of the things I think is tricky here is that we have, as a species, as a society, we've been working together for a long time. Like, humans have been around for a while. And humans have actually been working together in society in different forms. But it's easy to lose sight of the fact we only came up with the idea of factories 140 years ago. Steam engines and electricity and then factories all started in the 1880s. Before that, we just didn't do it. People made things and people lived in villages and communities and small, various sized towns that were kind of organically grown around a specific thing. But we didn't have this concept of people moving to the big city to get a job in a factory or in an office. That only started 140 years ago. And people would work together. And so you would learn all the human signs that we know, like how do you communicate grumpy, happy, sad, frustrated, bored, all these nonverbal cues. We get to learn them over some number of years or decades working together. And so we know when Bob is upset, or we know when Sarah's happy but doesn't want to talk about it, or we know what, because we can see it. And we can tell how you move or how you speak or how you wrinkle your eyebrows, all tell that nonverbal communication a lot better than specific words strung in a sentence that's grammatically correct. Right. That's fine. And we've been doing that for a while, but we stumbled into the idea of doing conference calls recently, like in the last 40, 50 years. And that conference calls has a couple of things. You're now working with people and you lose most of the nonverbal cues because you can't see them. You can barely make out tone to make out anger versus happy, depending on the audio quality and who else is on the call and who's making noise and doesn't know that they're not muted and all the other silly things that go on. So you suddenly downgrade all the communication capabilities down to like barely minimal. And the other one is that you now see people working together more on a kind of ad hoc project, doing outsourcing, or you're doing cross-company mergers and acquisitions, or you're even doing gig work or casual short-term contract work. So you don't allow long periods of time to build up a knowledge of how this person behaves under stress, how this person behaves when they're bored. Do I trust them? You don't have those nonverbal things sorted out, all those important social things. So you mix the two together where you have you downgrade the communication medium and you cut out all of the time and energy that's needed to build up all the nonverbal cues. And of course, it's really hard to have a working conference call. It's just,
and
you can predict it.
Right. And as much as video has helped, there are still aspects of those micro expressions that you can't get through video, even if it's high def.
Right. Yeah. And you can set it up, and it's in, of course it's in the book too, but you can set up things like, for example, we were talking earlier and it was both of us on Head and Shoulders video camera, so we could both see each other's expressions on our faces, and we were all properly lit and had a good background and all that kind of stuff. But you can also have companies that I've seen environments where people will either nobody turns on a camera because they don't want to, because reality is they're doing other things and they just don't want to they're barely paying attention to the meeting they're in unless you call out their name. So they're just sitting there, they're present technically, but not really present. And the other angle will be people go and buy expensive hardware and stick it on the wall of a room. And now you have a wall of a room with one microphone, and you have a group of people who are all studiously ignoring the camera on the wall, which means anyone who's on the other end of that camera really doesn't feel like they're being heard or seen. And then if people in the room start talking to each other, it doesn't matter how amazingly expensive and fantastic your audio microphones are, multiple speakers in a confined environment is really hard to separate out. So just having simple tactics to avoid these things help a lot. But you got to pay attention to the details.
One of the things that really struck me about the very beginning of your book was the idea of diversity in the workplace, and how having distributed remote teams can dramatically increase the diversity in your team. And I knew that, innately, but I hadn't seen it written out like that in black and white in text. And the thing that struck me was I just visited a wonderful startup in New York City in September. And I got to go to their office, which is in Chelsea, and got up into their office. And of course, the majority, I don't know if there was anyone over 40 in the room. And although the ethnicity was diverse, it didn't seem like a particularly diverse group. And I realized as I was reading this book, it's because if you are expected to show up at an office, there are certain things that you have to give up. And so, for instance, I thought, well, you're not going to have a parent of young children that has to commute into Chelsea, into the city or Manhattan, unless they have a lot of money already, or they are really committed, devoted to the culture and the mission and vision of an organization. Because I know when I had our first son, that commute changed my whole life. And I thought, I want to spend this time with my kid. And so it immediately shrunk down my options for the jobs that I would want to have.
Yeah. And you can't going to make an assumption here about a two-parent family for a second, but if you have a two-parent family, somebody has to be near. If you have a child and you put the child into some sort of daycare, or someone who's going to take care of the child during daytime, someone's got to be nearby in case the kid falls down in the playground or suddenly needs to be rushed to a doctor. That
Right.
means
And
if both parents take jobs that are an hour commute away, they can't. Like one can, but the other one must stay within a 30-minute to 15-minute range.
well, and when you think about the damage that does to our communities in
Yep.
terms of, let's say these parents don't have a choice. These are the jobs they got. They have to support their family. And so they are both an hour away from the daycare. And this kid gets sick, and it takes their parents an hour at least to get to them. And you
Hmm.
think about the damage to the psyche of both the parent and the child because of that.
Yeah.
And not to mention adults who are sandwich generation, who are trying to care for young kids or even adult children in their homes, but also their
Yep.
parents. They're the
Right.
parent caregiver.
Yep. It's
And
the-
there's so
yeah.
much creativity you lose and innovation you lose by not having that diverse group.
Sure. And you would, there's two important things there. One is because I agree with everything you just said, and I always, as an engineer, I'm always looking for data to back up. So it's not just an opinion statement, but where's there data that matches this? And if you have both people have to commute a long distance, at some point it's not feasible. Like what happens if you have to get back and the person who's the child caregiver says, I can't stay till you get home at 7 o'clock at night. I have to leave at 5 to deal with my own family. So now you have to leave your office an hour before 5, so 4. So what's that mean in terms of your employment situation? Does your company no longer think you're a real team player because you leave the office at 4 every day? Is that number one? And predominantly in this culture, it's still females who are the children caregivers. Predominantly, not always, but
Mm-hmm.
and so 43% of working mothers leave the workforce when they have kids. Like that's, at what point is it not worth it and you just give it up? And then when you look around for jobs that are near where the childcare is, they're not interesting or they don't pay as much as you end up paying at least the same amount to actually have childcare. So why work if you just spend the money all on childcare? You might as well stay at home.
Right. That was
Um,
our choice in my family.
right. And there's also Telefonica. It's too long for here, but people can look it up if they want. Telefonica did a study with World Bank in South America, in Buenos Aires, and they found they just mapped out where do people go with their anonymized phone tracking information, and they found for two income families, male female predominantly, two income families, whoever was the caregiver would go from the house to either the school or the elderly parents and then to the office, kind of a two-stop trip, whereas the male would predominantly be male, would go in a one-stop trip, straight line to the office and back. And so the female typically actually drove further distance, but had a shorter radius in terms of distance out from the house and back.
Mm-hmm.
And her radius of drive, it's hard to explain this on audio, but first trip would be from the house to wherever she was either dropping off children or visiting elderly parents or whatever was going on. That could be a reasonable drive. The second drive from there to work was very close, was
Right.
15, 30-minute max. And so you could draw with a compass a radius around these schools and daycare facilities and say caregivers would go work in a radius around this, but they wouldn't go further. And they found interesting data around how people wouldn't even apply for a job in a company office because it was too far from where the school was that they'd drop their kids at.
Exactly.
And the employer is like, we've got this great job. We have a hard time hiring diversely. And I was like, well, you are requiring them to commute. Change your requirements and step up your management game, and you could do this.
Right. And I love that your book talks about the value of remote working and talks about the beauty of it. But in the same breath, it also talks about how this can be damaging if you don't do it right, and
Mm-hmm.
how important it is to put systems in place before you start having consistently remote employees. I love that
Yeah.
about your book.
Wow.
So, can
Yeah.
you share with me something that happened in your career in terms of between being a remote employee and being an on-site employee, a situation that unfolded that can kind of demonstrate where where this interest and fascination came from?
How did I get interested in this?
I know there's a dot connecting going there somewhere.
Yeah, first I think is I didn't really know it was a thing. I had been, I'm a computer guy. I've been writing server-side code most of my life. And in hindsight, looking back, I realized most of the companies I was working in had people who are physically distributed in different locations. And so I'd be working with people across all sorts of time zones and all sorts of cities in different countries and different cultures and different languages and things like that. And I didn't see anything strange with that because I just thought that's the way work was. And I thought that was the way life was in general because I grew up with parents who were musicians who traveled a lot. So we didn't go to school at all till I was 12. And we kept moving cities and countries all the time. So I just thought this was, everyone does this, right? And then at some point in a school classroom, I discovered that other people's parents always went to work at 8 and came back at 6, and they'd lived in the same house their entire life. And I thought this was such a strange idea. And so I just had this idea that everyone always moves around and talks everywhere. So when I became a manager and I started noticing that I would have people coming into the office who were rare, like visiting, and they would want to meet me because they hadn't met me in person before, but they actually felt that because of all of our weird working hours and me taking phone calls at midnight and being happy to talk to them in their daytime time zone, because I didn't do anything else in my life. I was just working all the time. So I felt like I worked a 20-hour or 16 to 20-hour day every day, and I would just sleep. And then so I could take calls at 11 o'clock at night or 7 in the morning. I would just do this all the time. And I felt that I could take time to actually get to know people because I thought that was important. And that personal connection then turned into later on when something broke or blew up and people are all making assumptions because they don't know the humans involved. And I could stand up in a crowded room or in a very loud conference call and be like, no, wait a minute. Fred, to take a made-up name. So Fred is not like that. Fred doesn't do that. I think something else is wrong here. And then I could cite examples to prove why Fred was not of that characteristic or attribute that people were insulting about. And usually what was going on was people were frustrated and unhappy and wanted to just blame it on someone else and keep going. That was one part when I realized this human connection is important in general, and also not everyone was doing it. One other company I was working at, I had this episode where I had just built out a team of people that was fully remote, and we were all in different locations. And I had somebody who was smart engineering lead, leading a team of people, and he was very, very upset with me. And he was like ranting on about a few different things. And near the end of the rant, he's like, it's not fair. I'm remote and I don't know what's going on, but you and your entire team are all dialed in because you're all in headquarters. And I stopped for a second. I was like, and that like baffled me. I was like, what? And I said, could you say that? Just say that again. And he sort of repeated the same, he was male, repeated the same rant, very, very upset. And I said, hold on a second. You and I'm not in headquarters, and no one in my team is in headquarters, and no one in my team is in the same location as me. Now, there's 3 of them I'm in San Francisco, and there was 3 of them were in the Bay Area. So we'd meet up once every week, maybe twice a week sometimes, mostly for lunch, but that was it. But we actually had to plan for that day trip. We didn't actually meet every day. We didn't work together physically. And I said, wait a minute, we're not together, and we're not in headquarters. And the person totally stopped dead in their tracks, and they're like, what? And I said to repeat, and I said it all again. And then he said, well, how come you all know what's going on? And I had this deep, total silence. I was like, how do we know what's going on? Like, what's going on here? And I realized that I spent so much time organizing the communication and organizing how people do their work that everyone knew what was going on because I thought it was important. And I just assumed everyone else was doing the same. And here I had a scientific data point. Again, I'm always looking for data. So here I could show two engineering teams about the same size, about the same racial and gender breakdown, working on the same technical product in the same company, and one team being managed one way, another team being managed and led a different way. And team one didn't know what was going on. Team two, everybody knew what was going on and everyone could cover for everybody. There was no single point of failure. It was not all communication channeled through John. It was all, anyone could respond if John wasn't around. And if someone else wasn't around, other people could respond for them. And that's when I first realized that actually how you coordinate how people work and how you set up a process or cultural norms for how people work can totally change how a team behaves, and also how the humans have a good life or not, and a meaningful life. So this other team was not having a good time. They were having a lot of attrition and turnover. They were having a lot of frustration and arguments because they were stepping on each other's toes and they felt that other people weren't listening to them. Whereas this team, occasionally we would step on each other's toes and then we'd sort it out quickly because we all trusted each other. Most of the time we didn't step on each other's toes because we knew what each other were doing and we could coordinate and communicate with others. And that, to me, was a real, like, okay, in the same company.
Right.
So, like, and that's when I started talking, like, looking at it more seriously. And that became the spark that eventually turned into this book and all the other work I do around this.
That makes so much sense that you would look at it from that, I don't know, a 1,000-foot viewpoint, 10,000-foot view to see where the breakdown was. And we talked about that briefly before I hit the record button about your propensity to look for where things aren't quite right and to dig deeper than just being okay with the first thing that comes up.
Yeah.
So I love that story for a couple of reasons. One is the fact that this guy felt like he was so disconnected and he was able to just rant to you, and you're a listener. It's what you do. And part of that is because you're a problem solver and you know you have to get as much information as possible before you're going to be able to come up with any kind of approachable solution for this person who's so angry. So what ended up happening with this guy? Were you able to talk him down? Was this, again, part of that team that ended up with high attrition rates, turnover?
I ended up starting to write down first of all, I ended up just starting to talk through what I was doing, what I had not really been consciously thinking or verbalizing out. Like, how did I arrange team meetings? How did we arrange who took notes? How do we arrange who was working on what? And how do you update people on what's going on, especially if you're in a different time zone to me? So I started like, how did we do that? So I started writing it all.
Right.
And so just even the act of trying to explain it, talking to myself in the bathroom and talking in the bathroom mirror, or explaining to a friend, somebody else in the office or in a different company somewhere else, like, hey, how would you do this? Could you listen to me while I talk about this and see if it makes sense? I found that to be very, first of all, very formative for me. It made me kind of stop and think, like, why did we do it? Oh, we tried this other way and that didn't work. And that didn't work because of this. So maybe this is, so I started to think through those things. And then I started being able to talk about it. I ended up running these little workshops at that particular company. They also had company gatherings every year. And so I would run workshops at that company gathering every year for just people. I would keep working through this and I'd learn from other people what has worked, because other people have been trying this too, and what's worked for them, what's not worked for them. If it's something that's not worked, is it something that I've tried that also didn't work, or maybe they tried something different? And so I tried debugging all this, and I just, by explaining, I think the real thing for this individual was he was also a smart engineer, and when he discovered that he was not the only one who was remote, it was like, no, my team is remote and we're not in headquarters and we're not together and it must be something else. Then he also stopped and he's like, oh, and like blew all of his assumptions away. And then he's like, and it took him a while to actually get to it, but then he was like, well, why is it working for you? And so he was also then very curious, because he actually also, as a human, really cared about the people on his team. He cared about doing a good job himself professionally. Um,
Hmm.
and so he just had jumped to the first, and you just said this a minute ago, he jumped to the first plausible cause and stayed
Hmm.
there. Whereas I try my best to work down to the root cause. Like, what's the root assumption that's behind this? So it could be about this, but actually, if you go below that, then there's this other thing, and then there's this other thing, and then 3 or 4 steps down, you find like actually the root cause is this. Well,
Mm.
if I fix that, then suddenly all these other hard, intractable problems just melt.
Right. Or you can find a reasonable solution to them because you've addressed the root problem.
Right.
And, that's another part of the book that I really enjoyed is that the humility in it. I think a lot of people write books as if they know everything. And
Mm.
what I loved about it, and I think leadership in general takes that kind of humility if you're going to do it well, if you're
Mm-hmm.
going to bring a team together that's going to be super productive and innovative and feel safe
Mm-hmm.
to make choices and make decisions, you have to come at it with a level of humility. And in the
Mm-hmm.
book, you talk about the things that worked and what didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And there are times in the book where you talk about what didn't work with a level of humility that was just really appreciated because there was also a sense of humor to it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of the book, yeah, humility, and maybe it's a Silicon Valley thing now, like where people will, there's this whole phrase about humble bragging, where people are really bragging, but they're trying to make it sound like they're being humble. Like
Right. Oh, drives me crazy.
I
It's so
just,
fake.
I know, it's like, really. Um, like I got talked into writing the book, which is a whole separate, this will take a long separate podcast, so skip that for now. But like, I'd never considered that. I thought real professionals write books. Like, what am I going to do writing a book? This makes no sense. And I remember when the first physical copy of the book came back, once I started writing it, I was like, no, I want to write these things out. So I want people to know, at least don't make the same mistakes. If you want to make a new mistake, go right ahead. We'll all learn from it. That's great. But please don't make the same mistakes that everyone else has made. You
Hmm.
know, first of all, it's frustrating for you. You're not getting anywhere. You're also messing with other people's lives and your own life, because this is about how people work together. So this involves career and income, and how do people feel about themselves and their professionalism and stuff. So be respectful of all the people's lives that you're messing with here.
Hmm.
And so, if you want to make new innovative decisions and attempts, try new stuff. Don't,
Right. With
don't be,
humility, knowing that it's not all going to work and it's not all
right,
going to be
right.
perfect.
And then be listening. And I really do think, like, I view myself as someone who, I don't know all the answers. I won't know all the answers. If we're ever in a place where I'm the only one who knows all the answers, that's a real problem, because we want to have other people who can take over from me. What if I don't show up for work tomorrow? What if I either am sick, or I die, or I decide to quit and go to get a job somewhere else, or I'm just on a plane for 12 hours because I'm flying a long distance? Like, now what? So everyone should be able to take over and be confident that the things will be done well. So I want to have people be able to do that. So
And that
that
they'll
to
have
me
a
is
job when they get back. I
sure.
mean, you need to be confident that you're not working yourself out of a job and that you have to be there all the time to be valuable.
Yeah. And I really feel if you're doing the same job, there's some joke phrase about what do you give someone who's really good at digging ditches? You give them a new shovel. Like if all you ever want to do is this one thing, then okay. But if you want to keep doing new things, like once you've figured out and helped put together a particular area, then it's a different type of person who will keep it just ticking over. And it's a different type of person who will kind of incrementally scale that a little bit in one way or another. So maybe there's something else that might be interesting for you to move on to. And so maybe this is the time you do transitioning off, and succession planning is an important thing. So how do you make sure that whatever you're doing doesn't fall on the ground as soon as you stop coming to work tomorrow? Because then
Right.
what's the point of everything you did?
So
So I really feel the entire team has to be doing this. And so having my name in the front, like that humility you talked about, I I really, it's like, no, this was not written by me. This is not my stuff. This is like, here's all the people who've been doing different things in this space. I tried to make this the kind of concise, easy to read, fun to read summary that's practical of what a bunch of people have been trying to do. You know, I interviewed 180 something people for this book. And
wow, I didn't realize that. So when you're writing the book and
mhm,
you're remembering these specific incidents so that
mhm,
you could jot down specific stories about what worked and what didn't work,
mhm.
did anything surprise you when you looked back to write about it? Did anything kind of catch you a little off guard?
Yeah, actually, the people who know me, and you've heard me say this several times, like I care about humans a lot. Like I was very, I'm an engineer, so I was very focused on here's the process, here's how you take meeting notes, here's how you take shared meeting notes with shared people, and here's how you do group video and the mechanics around camera and lighting and cinematography and and all these details. That I sort of expected because I'm very much like that as a person, like how do you work the mechanics of something? Um, the bit that I didn't realize just how much it mattered to me was actually what became the chapter called diversity. And that chapter was actually you know, people who know me know I care about other humans. And, I've traveled a lot, and humans come in all shapes, sizes, and colors with different backgrounds and different cultures and different age brackets and different physical abilities. We have 7.4 billion individuals on this planet. Like they're all slightly different, and I've only
Mm-hmm.
met some of them, and they all have different ways of approaching problems, and some of them are like they have different reasons for not jumping onto a solution as fast as I would, and others would just leave me in the dust with like what I think of as a brilliant epiphany. And I'm like, how did you do that? That's amazing. And they're like, oh, it's natural because of blah, blah, blah. And what I didn't realize as I was going through writing the book was every chapter had some paragraph somewhere in it, a couple of paragraphs about different aspects of human diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was trying to review and rewrite and tweak each chapter and tone, it was like, this is a duplicate of that and bring these together. I ended up making this entire chapter. And there was some different editors at different times, and over the 3 years that I was writing this book, and there was different feedback from different people as to whether I should even talk about this. I'm quite seriously, I'm a white. If you look at me, I'm a white male engineer. So you're stereotypical Silicon Valley, uh, you know, white male engineer guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And why am I talking about diversity? And I'm like, well, actually, I have traveled a lot, and I'm not your typical Silicon Valley, Stanford MBA type. But I have been in all these other situations, and I have all these other backgrounds that people wouldn't think of. And I actually care about humans, and I think it would be wrong to not talk about it. This is part of the overall thing. How we work together as humans is how we respect, and not just respect in a kind of like use all the politically correct words for everything, but which, is respectful in its own way. And getting people's name right is another one.
Yes.
But also, like, why is this particular topic an issue for somebody? Well, listen to them. And like, if it's a big, scary topic, you could not talk about it. Plenty of people do that. Or you could try and have some quiet trust with somebody where you sit down quietly and say, I don't know why this is a problem. I've read about it on the internet and it says this and this, but that doesn't make sense to me. Could you explain to me why? And I want to make sure I'm not being disrespectful. So could you just explain it to me as if I don't know what it is? And so I would discover different like backgrounds on genocides that have happened in certain countries. And so people get very upset about one nation versus another. Or I discover different family backgrounds where somebody's parents had a hard time because they were one religion in a country that was predominantly another religion, or, all sorts of things. And people, you said earlier I was a listener, and I listen, and then I ask questions to listen more. And I would discover all sorts of things that were not being talked about, but were perfectly valid and logical. So it is perfectly valid and logical to be upset about this topic given that context. I just didn't know that background, so I didn't know why you're upset. Now I'm going to make sure everybody, and because of the other interesting thing is because I am a white male engineer, I've found it's interesting that other white male engineers will listen to me when I talk about diversity, which I didn't really think was a thing. I heard somebody, and I ended up quoting him. I got the page here in the book. I'll read it to you. He said it first, and I thought it was great. And I keep trying to find a way to say this more succinctly, but I'm going to just use his quote here. It's incumbent on every one of us to carry our fair share of the burden of advancing diversity. It's not right to ask the people who are already disadvantaged in their work to do all the extra work of advocacy.
Who was that?
And that was, his name is Michael Lopp. He was at the time he was VP of Engineering at Slack. And he's written a really good book actually called Managing Humans, which I would also recommend. So there's a plug for Michael's book as well. And there's a few other books, but his is a very approachable, short anecdotes of all the different he's the other manager I've came across in life who actually uses the word humans a lot. And he's also tall, so we got on well right away.
I love that you were surprised by that bubbling to the surface of your book, because the book was really designed about the application, the engineering and systems behind remote employees and how to make that work. And the fact that it surprised you that the humanity that bubbled up from the surface was such an integral part of the success of your remote teams and what you were trying to accomplish. So thank you for sharing that. I'm still kind of puzzling over it.
Yeah, I'll add one other thing. As I think through, I mean, that one chapter really was, I remember when I finished writing that chapter, I was like, really nervous. I was like, God, I hope people like that. And I was really proud of it. And I was like, well, if they don't like it, it's all true. And well, so be it. Like, there we go. The other part of it is like, when I, again, as an engineer, like I really did think a lot of it would be mechanical. Like, here's how you do video calls. Here's how you do notes. But and that's a third of the book. But a third of the book is, how do you interview human stuff? How do you interview? How do you deal with stress and conflict and isolation and trust? And I didn't realize how much I was doing that also.
Well, you can't be successful
that is not
without
written down anywhere,
That's the major component. You can't be successful without recognizing those aspects, the humanity of your workforce. And I think we're seeing that more and more. I know there are Humans First conferences going on. You see so much more writing about trying to bring people out and having their whole selves be part of their work, because you're missing a huge section of a human brain if you're just treating them like a cog. And so I think there is a shift going on. I wish it would happen a little faster. I get really frustrated and a little bit discouraged because I worked in the public sector for so many years, and boy, that most of the agencies are just so far behind in terms of valuing employees and understanding how to bring out the natural talents of the people that you're working with. So I really appreciate your taking the time to talk about this with me, John. It's been such a good conversation. I can't believe we've already gone for an hour.
Really?
It's kind of amazing.
Yes, I have too. And I would have lost a bet if you said it was an hour. I would have been like, oh, about 20 minutes,
It does go by fast.
It's really great. Thank you for doing this.
Yes, absolutely. And for our listeners, I will have a link to connect with John on LinkedIn,
Hmm.
on the podcast blog that's associated with the podcast. I'll also have a link to his book and the book he referenced by Michael, is it Lem?
Lopp,
Lopp.
Lopp.
Okay. I'll definitely have a link to that as well so that our listeners can look it up easily if they are interested in buying that book.
Hmm.
And I have a feeling I'm going to ask you back on my podcast in the next few months because I'm really fascinated by being able to connect authentically and then leverage that technology to meet face to face and make those connections even more valued.
Yeah, I would love to be back. I, amongst other things, as I said at the beginning, this has been a really great privilege, is the word I would use, actually. So thanks for having me. I'd love to be back. And I do to the other, when we talked about community earlier, part of what I think is interesting here is not only is it about people being able to work well when they're physically apart, it is also about literally building communities. And
Mhm.
that's been a weird side effect of this book that I find really exciting as well. So
Yes,
it's great.
absolutely. Thanks again, John.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com. Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?